Welcome to the Next Level Human podcast. As a human, you have a job to do. In fact, you have 4 jobs: to earn and manage money, to attain and maintain health and fitness, to build and sustain personal relationships, to find meaning and make a difference. None of these jobs are taught in school, and that is what this podcast is designed to do: to educate us all on living our most fulfilled lives through the mastery of these 4 jobs. I'm your host, Dr. Jade Teta, and I believe we are here living this life for 3 reasons and 3 reasons only: to learn, to teach, and to love. In this podcast, I will be learning, teaching, and loving right along with you. I'm grateful to have your company. Here's to our next level. All right, what's going on, everybody? Welcome to the show. I got my really sweet friend here with me, good friend Emily Gough, on the show today. We're going to talk about some of our favorite subjects, but let me tell you a little bit about her first. She is an expert in business training. So if you're someone who's an entrepreneur who's trying to get into the internet space, this is your girl. And by the way, if you're watching us on video, that's Justin Janoska in the back. Justin, say hi to us. Emily also does a ton with podcasting, which is a huge part of what you teach in business. Yep. One of the things that we really vibe on, you and I, and so I know for those of you who are into business, definitely check out Emily. But today we're going to just kind of go back and forth, and we might touch on that. So we're going to just see where this goes. But one of the things you and I vibe on a lot is relationships.
We do.
And a little bit about our story. We were each in different sides of the drama that can be affairs and relationships. I was the perpetrator, and you were the person being the affair perpetrated on, in a sense. And so we come from different sides of this, and we oftentimes get in deep conversations about this. And I know you talk about it a lot. I talk about it a lot. I've been on your podcast. Yep. Talking about this as well. And I wanted to just get a sense from both of us, give my listenership a sense of how we've made sense of this. Because one thing that's unique about you and I is that when I talk to you, I don't seem to ever, and I want you to correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't seem to ever get from you any lingering hurt, trauma, dysfunction, or anything like that around this. It seems like you've taken what has happened and almost like turned it into gold. You seem incredibly happy and incredibly well-adjusted. And I feel like, I hope I have sort of done the same thing. And I know a lot of people, they go through these things and they never can find balance again. And so I just want to start by sort of asking you a little bit about your story, whatever you think we need to know, and then kind of giving us sort of your take on how you've been able to adjust in this way, and how you think it might, behoove people to start looking at their relationship dysfunction in a different way. And we can even go into, all the different stuff about dating and all of that kind of stuff as well. But I'm just really interested on where you'd really like to start and how you got to where you are.
Oh, thank you for all of that. I mean, the most succinct way to describe my story is that I found out it's all kinds of dramatics attached to it, that I found out on Christmas Eve that my partner of 9 years had been having an affair with a previous girlfriend for our entire nine years together, off and on. He had like a secret house 170 meters away for several years. There was a lot that came out, and I ended the relationship right away, and I made the decision very early on that I was going to turn it into the best thing that ever happened to me, that I needed to make that choice, because otherwise, I felt as though I would have thrown away 9 years of my life. Mm. And I was so determined to pull every possible lesson out of that. I knew right away that I would end up coming out with it at some point, but I knew that I had a lot of work to do between now and then. And I think that the reason I so appreciate you saying that you feel I'm very well adjusted from all of this. And I think a big part of that is because I put in so much work and continue to put in work. That's not, I don't think that any human ever gets to the point of being healed. There's always more to heal from. There's always going to be more suffering. You talk about that a huge amount, Jade. And I think that as long as we approach life with the lens of what can I learn from this and how can I grow from this? And I also tend to think that living through a so-called sort of worst case scenario. There are many more worst case scenarios, far worse than that. But one example of a so-called worst case scenario is that you tend to look at everything in a slightly different lens, especially when it comes to relationships. And you and I have had conversations about how the so-called fairy tale can be lifted a little bit with romance when you have seen the other side. And we said at dinner the other night, we're like, you and I, we've seen some things.
We've been there.
We've been there. We've seen some things. And I think that does change you, but it doesn't have to change you for in a more negative way, because I know people who will hang on to that hurt for years or even decades. And they never recover from it. They never learn from it. And they continue to repeat the same patterns over and over again. Yeah. And I was so determined to break that pattern that I was like, 9 years, I can't go through this again. I can't go through this again. I can't guarantee I will never be cheated on again, but I can guarantee that I will see the signs sooner and that I will make different choices to end up in a different situation.
Yeah, patterns are huge. Let me ask you something. I'll put you on the spot here. You just be like, Jade, fuck off if this is too much.
No, you ask me anything.
So have you ever cheated on anyone else, and have you or were potentially moving in that direction that you're aware of? Or
I
that
love
you
you're asking
share?
me this.
Yeah.
No one ever asked me this. I love that you're asking me that. I have not ever cheated on anybody. I was, however, I've never spoken about this publicly, even privately. I rarely speak about this. I was the other woman for like 2 weeks. In a very, very short-lived relationship way early on in my late teens, early 20s.
And by other woman, so you're meaning he was married and you were with, or just he was dating?
Okay, so he was dating somebody else, and we ended up together very, very briefly. He and I both were not really okay with that, and it ended very quickly because of that. But yes, I have been in that position. Yeah.
And the reason I bring that up, because as you begin to talk about patterns, one of the things I want to explore with you, one of the things I've seen, and briefly, most of you are listeners know my story, but just very briefly, I was caught in the best way I describe it. It's a silly way to describe it, but what I call a betrayal sandwich. So in a sense, I was betraying, and the woman I was with, she was married, and then, so she was betraying her husband with me, obviously, but then she got with a third person and was then betraying me. And so I was in this incredible turmoil. And what I figured out, and I want to see where this came for you as well, as I was debriefing on all of this over years, and it did take years, right? So it wasn't like overnight, but as I started to turn myself around and look at what I'd done, I realized that there were certain patterns in my life previous to that, even as a kid, that had kind of set me up for this. And one of the things that I think is critical here is realizing that, okay, if I have these patterns repeated again and again and I don't do anything about them along the way, they are going to recur. And I'm wondering about your particular patterns in that regard. So I just want to have that sort of conversation with you a little bit. And by the way, I had never cheated on. I wasn't a recurrent cheater, so I had never cheated on anybody. But I did see the signs. They were there. I didn't realize they were there until it actually happened, but I did see the signs. Things like the neediness for female attention and some of the issues I had around my mom, etc. So I'm wondering, did you, as you've debriefed on this, when you talk about patterns, do you see any of those that kind of set you up for any of this, or even identifying it? Because maybe not, but maybe you saw, oh my gosh, I saw these patterns in men and certainly did not heed them. So I'm just curious on how you see that, because I think it's really interesting to begin talking about how someone, if they're in this process, how they can begin to see the patterns, either now if they're currently in it, or actually go back and start to see the patterns, because I do think awareness is sort of the first step of this. So I'm just curious about your insights there.
Yeah, awareness is just always the first step. And I think that for me personally, I grew up with a very emotionally unavailable father. And then when my parents split up, he sort of kind of severed the relationship, and then I made the final sever. I decided that I was done with that. So that lingering sense of rejection and abandonment definitely held on. And I think that I was so determined to do whatever it took to have the opposite relationship that my parents had, and to do anything that it took to hold that relationship together. I think that was partly why it went on for 9 years, was because later I could see all of the signs looking back where my intuition had been screaming at me, and I kept ignoring it because I just was so determined that this relationship was going to work, and to a fault, basically. And I had also had a habit of ending up with men who were typically fairly emotionally unavailable. This particular man seemed to be somewhat the opposite of that, which was what I found attractive about him, because I'd kind of started to break some patterns by that point. But looking back at it now, he was very emotionally unavailable. He just presented in a very different way because he was a bit of a chameleon. He could appear how he needed to appear given the situation.
So, okay. So this is interesting. Let me just see if I've got this correct, because I think this is what I find interesting, and I want to see if anyone else picked up on this and if I even got it correctly. So you had a very emotionally unavailable father. So one of your parent figures was a tough thing for you. And then it seemed like you began to repeat that pattern with men in your life, if I'm reading it correctly. And then you run into a man who you're just like, oh, he's not that way. And so kind of the chameleon presents something different. And you're like, okay, so I didn't want those, but this guy seems good. But he tended to still be, in the end, this particular pattern of not being emotionally available. And now I'm like, okay, so you see that again and again. And in life, I oftentimes see that first it taps us on the shoulder, it whispers in our ear, then it smacks us in the face, and then finally it kicks us in the stomach. And so now I'm like, so now what's your insight sort of around that, and how do you approach things now? Are you like, there's two ways, I guess, to approach it, right? One way is just like, listen, I'm always going to fall for men who are a little bit more emotionally available, so I'll accept that and make some adjustments. Or two, I've learned not to deal with those types. And I'm just curious how you sort of see that, or how much time you even spend thinking about it at this point.
No, I spend a lot of time. I have spent a lot of time thinking about it because you and I've talked about this before too, that I feel like I've completely changed what I value in a human being. And I now look for very specific things. And I've also talked to you about the fact that I tend to have, I'm observant to the point of hypervigilance. That is something that's only usually born from trauma, that I pick up on things so quickly now. And I attribute that to being so much more in touch with my intuition now than I was before, when I spent so long ignoring it, that now I've spent so much time pouring into that and paying attention to it, that I pick up things about people very quickly that sometimes they don't even notice about themselves. And I can read people very differently than I used to. And I really value that because it's something that I use not only in personal, like romantic relationships, but in friendships, in business relationships. We all need to learn to listen to our intuition. And the only way we learn that is by ignoring it for extended periods.
Yeah, and then it kicking our ass.
Exactly.
As a result of that. Yeah, it's really interesting. I'm curious. I'm curious, what are the things, if you don't mind sharing, like what are the things that, you sort of go, all right, these are my must absolutely haves that you're picking up, and then I want to know what they are, and I want to know, like, how do you evaluate these things in people, especially if they're not consciously aware of them. So like, what are the major things? Like, a guy needs to have this and this and this, and I can see that they do or don't by this and this and this.
I mean, other than, to me, the very basic things would be, like kindness and just sensing that somebody has a good heart. That's obviously really important, but that was always important. I think that some of the things that have become much more important to me more than ever are things like honesty, trust, and integrity. And even though those are three separate things, I tend to tie those all up together, because to me, you can't really have one without having all of them. Yeah. So those are very important. And one of the ways that I evaluate that is noticing, again, very, very small things. Like if somebody tells me one little thing, it's almost as though I've trained myself to not double check, but I just pay attention and I see if that's the actual way that they are coming across. And I see how they treat other humans as well. And if they show up in those relationships with integrity and honesty, those are really some of the most important things to me by far. Because, somebody's job can be one thing, or there are all these other things that we look for on paper, but I'm much more interested about what's on the inside.
Yeah.
And that's far more important, because that you're choosing somebody to grow with, and you can't grow you'll certainly grow, but just in much harder ways if you don't pay attention to what you value most. But then you have to show up with those values too. You can't expect somebody else to show up with those values if you aren't showing up for them yourself.
Oh, that's so good. Yeah, so for me, it's really interesting because very similar. You and I have talked about this before. Certainly honesty, good communication, kindness, which was always there. And then it's recently, like I have a story here recently of a woman that I was, sort of getting to know, and it happens oftentimes online on Instagram. And so on the one hand, I can evaluate this kind of stuff and go, okay, so how is she with communication? All right, pretty good. How are her core values? And all I can do is look at and see some of the stuff and there were some red flags there, in that regard. And then one of my other things is, and this goes back to patterns. So my mother, I had an incredibly good upbringing. I had two parents who loved me and treated me fantastic, but my mom had dysfunctions because of her childhood. Now, she didn't purposely put them off on me, so I was not abused by any stretch. In fact, I was deeply loved, but she was at times she was just volatile. At times she wasn't emotionally available, and at other times she was just an emotional thunderstorm, right? And so what I tended to do is find mainly women in my younger years who were a little bit emotionally volatile. Then I married a woman who is much more just stable and, if anything, emotionally stoic, right? And so in a sense, I kind of went back and forth. And now with this particular latest thing, I caught myself catching those two patterns where I was like, oh, this is way too emotionally volatile. And so now it's like finding those grays. But more importantly, I go, how are you showing up? Because I also have, to your point, honesty is critical for me, but also good communication and also staying emotionally stable. It's almost like I do not want to put my emotional storms on someone else, nor do I want their emotional storms put on me. What I want to do is act as maybe an anchor or a lighthouse in their storms, but I do not want to be in their storms with them, right? Because if I am, then I can't actually do anything to potentially help them. I'm in this, and some people do want you to be in their emotional storms, and that's how and
it absorbs you.
That's how they want their relationships to be because it's familiar to them. And so for me too, I'm sort of looking at those sort of same things. And I guess I'm curious now, like let's say we have someone that you and I are working with, talking to a friend or, even a client. I do a lot of this work, and I think you actually do some of this work as well. Yeah, I think you just do. I know you do business coaching, but I think you end up doing this work regardless. What are the sort of the number one things that you find, or you would say, here's what I tend to see, that the mistakes that people are making in relationships? I'm really curious, and let me just frame it this way, because and I want to see what you think about this, and I want to see what the listeners think about this. Here's my theory. Whenever you get somebody who's like, my parents have been married for they're 50 plus years now, right? So I think they're going on 60 years. A lot of people go, oh, what's the secret, right? And as much as I love my parents, I just go, I don't want to hear from my parents about relationships. That one was 19, one was 24. My mom had hardly been with anyone. Like my dad was her first substantial relationship. So what I want to hear from is I want to hear about the person who was in love, the person who was cheated on, the person who cheated on, the person who had all the romantic experiences and have this degree of wisdom to sort of share. And I know you have been through a lot of this. So have I. And I want to know the insights around that. What are the mistakes that you think, and you and I don't think have talked about this, so I'm really interested. What are the mistakes that you think people make? And do you even agree with what I'm saying there anyway, in terms of like who you would rather take advice from? And I want to.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, which is funny because you and I were just saying the other day, I said, I'm always surprised when people come to me for relationship advice when I'm the girl that was cheated on for 9 years. Yeah. But it is like there is a degree of wisdom that comes with that if you actually find ways to heal from it.
Yeah.
But when it comes to what we kind of look for, so are you talking about when we are speaking to somebody else, like figuring out from other people what is kind of going wrong there?
That too, but I just want to see where you went. I'm literally talking about, and I'll frame it up a little bit more, but I feel like when people go into romance and relationships, they come in with a bucket load of stories, okay? And these stories are varied and like, diverse, right? It's like the one story, it's like they look like this, they act like this, whatever. The, sort of fairy tale Hollywood story. And they come in with all these expectations and assumptions and stories about things. And then reality hits. And I'm wondering, for you, what do you see as some of those stories or some of the things that you think people make huge mistakes with? Like, here would be an example. One of the things I have seen with men is that they try to play this like almost like a game instead of just showing up and being who they are. And I oftentimes say, this whole idea of the alpha male, you really want to be the authentic male. If you show up one way and then become something different, you're asking for trouble. I think men struggle with that. It's one of the key mistakes that they make. I think a lot of times what women do is they make the key mistake of having a story about the way this is all supposed to go. It looks very Rapunzel or very like Beauty and the Beast or very whatever, and then it inevitably blows up in their face. And I'm wondering how you see some of these things.
Yeah, I definitely see a lot of that as well. The other thing, I think this is big for men and for women, is it comes back to communication. We expect our partner to just understand us. To like, what do you mean you don't understand? You can't read my mind. Like, but I want it this way. Even when it comes to in the bedroom, I've talked about this before, that I have girlfriends who will sleep with somebody new and they'll say that it was awful and they'll write them off after the first time. I'm like, did you tell them what you like? Did you tell them what you don't like? Yep. Did you have that conversation? Also, sometimes the first time just isn't great anyway. Yep. Let's be real. Yeah. So it has to come down to that communication. And I think that sometimes people will tend to think that women are much better at communicating. That can be true. But I mean, there are sometimes I find men who can be good at communicating, but then the woman kind of like, and we're speaking in heteronormative terms here, but then the woman can kind of like shy away and then try to mold herself to whatever the man wants. This can go any number of different ways, but that communication piece is really key, because we can't expect somebody to understand who we are and what we need on any given day at any given moment. Yeah. And that's when we start to tell ourselves all of the stories and to make assumptions and, oh, he's behaving this way because of this. And it could be completely something that has nothing to do with you, but we make it about ourselves. And then that's where those stories become really dangerous. Resentment builds, contempt happens, and then the relationship falls apart.
Yeah, it's so critical. And by the way, yeah, the heteronormative, that's all we can talk about, because that's what we are. So I hope no one is offended by that, but it's the nature of the conversation when you're dealing with two people who we are hetero in the way we approach things. So let me go here, because you touched on something that I know a lot of people are going to be interested in. So let me just ask you then. So let's go through two things with you, and then I'll give you mine, because I think it'll be interesting. Your sort of sense of what women want, and I want to know sort of your general sense for you, and also take into account all of your sort of girlfriends and the conversations you've had. What is it that women are really, you think, wanting in general? And then also I want to get your sense of where you think the state of men are and what men are doing wrong. And then I'll do the same thing, because I think it'll be sort of fun to kind of have that conversation.
I mean, women want a man who's going to show the fuck up, like both literally and metaphorically, because that's when the games start. If that doesn't happen, then and that actually is a huge red flag for me. If somebody is inconsistent, if they're not dependable, if they don't follow through on their word, all of those things also trickle down to like trust, integrity, and honesty too, which are kind of like the core things that I look for. But I talk to so many girls or so many women out there who, and I feel the same way, who it doesn't. I think that there's this huge misconception that women are very high maintenance. And I think that that's a huge stereotype. And a lot of women have shied away from that because they think that their needs are too much. And I told a friend of mine who was going through some relationship issues a year ago, I said, you are not needy. You're a human with needs. And there's a big difference. And we're all humans with needs. And you have to be able to communicate that. And if the person on the other side isn't able to meet you where you're at, then they're probably not the right person for you. I hate to use that term from that movie or the book or whatever, like he's just not that into you. If a man is that interested in you, he will show the fuck up. And if he's not showing up for you and you have communicated in a reasonable manner what you are looking for, then it's time to move on. And that's when we get into what you and I were talking about the other night with like the off and off again, on again situations. And I never actually really understand that very much because I think it's just my personality. I'm sort of in or I'm out. I'm like, okay, wait, are you in? If so, and if I also want to be in, then yes, let's do this. But I don't do the on again, off again. And I think that's a cycle that a lot of people get stuck in. And then they're always hanging on to those little breadcrumbs of hope.
Yeah.
And that's where it's really important to get really clear on what you want as a human, how you are showing up. And then the right person will probably come along at one point or another. You just can't control the timelines. But that's, I think, where men get it wrong, is that they want to play the games because society has taught us that to some degree, and taught men that, like, oh, don't call for 3 days. You'll think that she'll think that you're too interested, and then you'll scare her away and all those things. It's all bullshit. It's all smoke and mirrors. You have to be able to just show up for the person that you're interested in. And we make it so much harder than it needs to be. So much harder than it needs to be.
Yeah, I'll actually start with, I think, because you tapped into something, I'll start with one of the things, the mistakes that I think women make. And this comes from, mainly I've worked with mostly women and coached mostly women in relationships. So believe it or not, I think I actually know more about women in relationship than men, just because I've worked with thousands. Here's the mistake that I think that women tend to make, and it's very similar to what you were saying with a slightly different twist. It basically goes like this. I think women enter in with more stories about relationship than men do. And it's a very gross generalization, but I will use it because I do think it's helpful. I do think as a gross generalization, women are oftentimes more stability-oriented than freedom-oriented, whereas men are more freedom-oriented and less stability-oriented in general. Now, this can switch, but I'm just going to say in general. My theory is every relationship you have someone who's a little bit more the freedom person and someone who's a little bit more the certainty, stability person. And so there's this dynamic here. And I think ultimately what happens is there's a couple things that happen with men that I think women need to understand. We come at this very differently. It's very true, and I think I understand women don't like this, but it's just the fact of the way how men see women. They are evaluating you on the romantic, physical sort of realm, usually first. It's sort of the way the male brain is working. It's like, is she attractive? Does she like, do those pheromones hit me? Is this someone that I would sleep with? Now, this is a very young male we're talking about. It does change as a man gets older, I think, and it changes with maturity. But that's the first thing that happens. So I think the first thing women sort of need to understand is that they're expecting a man to be like, I choose you and I choose you now. And the truth of the matter is men sort of look at it like, well, I want to sleep with you, but that's not the same for me as wanting to be with you. And women don't necessarily get that, because I do think in general, for women, it is, I want to sleep with you means I want to be with you. For men, those are two separate things, and women get a little bit confused by this. And so there's a sense of the term I use, confident detachment, and I tell women this all the time. I'm like, understand that if a man is in that place, give him a little bit of time, because that's how they work. But if you choose to sleep with him, and if he becomes a different person at that point in time, it's time for you to begin to start seeing this may not be the guy who's ready to sort of commit to me. And this is where this problem goes, where he's one guy before we sleep together and he's another guy after we sleep together. And this usually happens when, sort of men are young. So I think women not knowing that particular story. Then the other part that I think, and this I actually have seen with women as they've been through some stuff, I think women miss the fact that men need a little training. I don't want to make it seem like men are dumb. But what happens is men need some time to show up. The way men's timing is oftentimes different than women. I oftentimes say this: women fall faster and fall out of love faster. Men fall in love slower and fall out of love slower. This is why all my female friends have men years later still chasing them around, madly in love with them, and they're like, "Where were you when we were actually dating?" It's just
people don't realize that men actually fall out of love much slower,
much slower. They become attached slower, and they fall out of love slower. And so I think women need to give men time. If they're like, he didn't call, or he said he's going to call, he didn't call. it's about communicating, hey, I need you to show up that way, but also being a little bit lenient in that. Because I think what happens is the reason why women oftentimes get labeled as needy by men is because men are kind of in their head, whether they say it or not, being like, it's not really time for that yet. So in a sense, it's not that they can't. They're just not seeing that we don't know each other well enough yet for this kind of discussion to happen, right? Like I've certainly for me, I've been in situations where it's like, I just met you, we just started talking, and now you're visibly or upset because I didn't call you that day when I got caught up doing something else, right? So this is why. But as you get closer in relationships, if a man keeps not showing up that way, I think that's a really good sign. Now, women oftentimes ask me, they're like, well, how long should I wait, Jade?
And that was more what I was referring to because, in the very beginning, I love how you phrased it as confident detachment because that also comes down to expectations. And when I interviewed a sex therapist recently on my podcast, Room to Grow, and she put it beautifully. She said, expectations break our hearts. And I was like, that's exactly it. In romance and in life and in business, all of those things, when we project those expectations, somebody is inevitably going to let you down. We're going to let ourselves down at that point. So you have to go into it to kind of bring it full circle, with the mindset of, what can I learn from this? How can I grow from this? How can this person grow me? How can I, get the most out of this in the best possible way and not be so attached to an outcome? And that's very difficult to do. That's so much easier said than done. Yes.
The way that I phrase that too, I'd like, have expectations, but only for yourself. That's the only, and that comes from, I will expect myself to, if I'm not getting my needs met, to communicate them. And if I'm still not getting my needs met, to go, right? Yeah. Like it's that, those are the expectations, not the expectation that someone's going to show up and be your story. Yep. Or be your type or whatever, because they're just not. I think that's hugely important. I do think the confident detachment stuff is even more important for men, because I think what women don't really understand about men, and men don't understand really at all, is that we don't see this in our culture talked about, but men are extremely insecure around rejection. Now, for many men, they've been rejected hundreds of times, if not thousands of times. So in a sense, they're used to it, but they're also expecting it. And so one of the ways women can evaluate men is the way in which they're rejected. Now, you might even like the guy, but if you do a slow play, it's kind of like, I'm not into you yet. And if the man, and this goes to your point, if the man continues to pursue, it says a lot about him, because essentially it says, I'm confident. Rejection is not something that is going to destroy me, and I know what I want, and I want to be here. And actually, women can find that very, very attractive. The problem, though, is that is two types of men that show up that way. One is the, quote, player type, who's very good at this and knows that if I just do it this way, women are going to love me. And the other part is the authentic guy. And so, again, women then have to go back and be like, let me not put one story from my past relationship on this guy. And you'll know the difference after you sleep with the guy. If he starts showing up the exact same way, you've got the authentic type. If you got the player, he's going to be immediately a little bit different. And these are sort of the stories that I think are important. And then I want to go into, and then we can begin to wrap this up. But like, to me, that's the meeting part. And I want to see if you have anything else to say about that. But then I want to go into the relationship, sort of part of this, where it's like, okay, now you're together, and how all this is going to work, given that we know oftentimes and many times now it probably or may not. So where do you want to go with that?
I mean, we could take that any number of different directions. Yeah, I mean, it's really about like showing up for the other person too. And we actually spoke the other night about you were talking about how men need the woman to believe in them.
Oh yeah, we should cover this.
Yes, I think that's really, really important, because that comes down to sort of that male provider role, which is, women don't realize how important that is. Like when your man is getting super focused on work, and it's legitimately focused on work, not like in a situation where I was being told it was work and it actually wasn't. But when it's the real deal, you have to kind of look at that in a slightly different lens. And I'm not saying, you still need to be communicating. You still need to be communicating your needs, all of those things. But the male provider thing is real. And if a man is struggling with work and finances and all of that, then not only does he need to know that you still believe in him, but you need to take that into consideration in terms of how he might be pulling back a little bit from you. And it's not necessarily personal, but it can be very difficult to not take that personally.
Yeah.
That's tough. And I'm not saying that this same situation can't also be applied to women, but I think with men, it's much more evolutionary, much more evolutionarily based.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'll explain what it's like to be a male from this perspective. I mean, because I know women will relate to this. You know how as a woman, especially women with kids and everything, one of the things I've learned is they do every damn thing, right? So they're taking care of the kids, they're doing the cooking, the cleaning, they're also managing their career. They're oftentimes managing the finances. They're just doing everything. And so imagine that you're doing all of this kind of stuff. And I think this is a very interesting story is why most women cheat. And the male is just not really noticing, not really helping, not really saying, baby, you're amazing, and not really putting much time and effort into that. So that goes on with women a lot. And many women who are listening to this are like, oh, yes, I know what this looks like.
Oh, yeah.
The same thing happens to men, and it happens like this. If you come in with a story for a man, right? And that man is slightly different, and you are constantly trying to get him to live in this story without ever trying to understand his story, and also understanding the context of man, which is very much this. I once studied with a male psychologist. He's like one of the last Jungian psychologists around, and his name's James Hollis. There's his books on my shelf there. But one of the things he said, he goes, women often ask me what it's like to be a man, and he goes, I'm going to tell you exactly what it's like to be a man. It's like being involved in a game, a zero-sum game, where you must win to be deemed as successful and powerful. You don't know the rules of the game. You just know if you're not seen as successful and powerful, people don't respect you, women don't, and nor do men. And so it's this sort of free-for-all of trying to figure out how to look, feel, be powerful and successful. Now imagine you're in a relationship where the woman is essentially saying all the time, you're not doing X, you're not doing Y. And that to a man is like taking his power away, because all a man wants to do is, do you believe I can? Right? Even if he's not doing it yet, he needs to believe he can do the things, and also needs, I would say, one of the most powerful things you can do for any man, and they really should do it for themselves, is define success on their terms. An example would be my father, where he essentially said, I am not going to, put my time and effort into getting up the managerial chain and making more money. He's like, I'm going to make sure I go to every single one of my kids' football and baseball practices. I'm going to take my wife out to lunch every day. He defined his own success. So I think that's the struggle that happens with women and men, that men need to do this themselves. But anytime you're constantly showing discontent about a man living into your story without understanding his, what should be done is, baby, what makes you feel like you are getting there? What are your dreams? How do you want to show up? And how can I support that? In the same way that you want the man to see what you're doing and support you. And oftentimes we can be fairly hypocritical, both men and women, in this realm, where we say, well, you want this, but we're not actually giving it.
Well, and I think it's also about acknowledgement. Like just acknowledging the other person's experience and what the other person is doing for you. Like sometimes even just a simple thank you, but if you can put a little bit more effort into it, that's great. Because it really, especially right now, women's unemployment rates have skyrocketed, about women having to not only being laid off, but being forced to leave the workplace because of the pandemic, because they're the ones having to usually hold it down at home, because right now with the homeschooling situation and all of that type of stuff. And that is only adding and compounding to that problem. And I've talked to a lot of women who feel like we've taken 30 steps back just because of this pandemic alone, with that in mind. And if there's somebody at home who's doing all of those things, and there's a lot of stress, whether it's financial or otherwise, that then usually also turns into emotional stress, all of these different things, because 2020 is the year of overwhelm, it seems like. Then this is the year where I predicted at the very beginning of this, I'm like, you are going to see relationships crumble.
Absolutely.
You are going to see relationships absolutely crumble, because we're also talking about putting people together at home all the time. And that has like that's changed back a little bit now that things have opened up again a little bit. But you're putting people together in a home together 24/7, potentially with kids as well. And no space, no personal time, no nothing. You're asking for problems there. And frankly, I think that any relationship that can survive those types of circumstances has probably got a pretty solid foundation and some really great communication, because there are so many people I've talked to who have struggled with that, and rightfully so. That's not an easy situation for anybody to deal with. And that's where that acknowledgement and that communication really has to step it up big time if that's going to be able to survive.
Yeah, it is amazing. And you're going to see, I think you're going to see a lot of people splitting up and a lot of people getting sort of back together. And actually, let's cover this as a final sort of thing, because I think you and I have a useful way to do this, or at least useful insight. So let's say you are someone who has found yourself out of a relationship. Maybe you were married for a long time. Maybe it was cheating. Maybe it was just you didn't want to be together anymore. You fell out of love, and you find yourself in this very weird time that we're in. 2020 withstanding, but we're in a weird time anyway with online dating and all this kind of stuff. In your sense, how do you feel like women and or men, manage this, and how they should begin to show up learning from their lessons? Like, what would you say are, look, I mean, here's how you best should look at romance and romantic relationships in general, in the context of your life as a whole, if you have any insights there?
I think that the biggest part is to take responsibility for your own actions, because you have to be really fucking honest with yourself and to take a look at past relationships and start to pick up on some of the patterns. And that might not be glaringly obvious. You might need to spend some time with that and to dig into that. Like after my relationship ended, I hired a relationship coach, as well as I had an ongoing therapist. I still work with both of them because I was so determined to not project unhealed trauma into my next relationship. And not only for the sake of that relationship, but for my own sake as an individual. And I'm not saying that that's also from a place of privilege that I was able to have the resources to be able to do that. Not everybody can do that. So I think that where everybody needs to start is to really start to examine the patterns in your relationship, in your various relationships, past or present, and to start to take responsibility where even if you feel that you were wronged and that you were the quote unquote victim, which I'm not really a fan of, but let's put it that way, where can you take responsibility and you could have done something differently, or you want to do something differently going forward? Because that was one of the only ways that I was able to move past the ending of my relationship. And people have said to me, how have you managed to work through this so quickly? And I'm like, well, I am still working through some of it, but you can't put it all on the other person, because then you will continue to repeat those patterns over and over and over again until you start to unpack some of your own stuff and to get really clear on where you can start showing up differently for yourself and for the other people coming into your life. You won't see any differences. Yeah. You will continue to be stuck in that cycle and you won't be able to get out of it.
I love this. And I would echo this, and I'll add a couple of things that I think are important. But to me, if you're wondering in terms of what Emily's saying, well, how do I know it's me? Mm-hmm. To me, I go, patterns that are you repeat. Patterns that are someone else are single things, right? So for example, if you've been cheated on multiple times, mm-hmm. and that's a pattern, I'm not saying it's your fault, but perhaps there's something there that you are unaware of that is something that you need to address. Like it could just be you're not very good at picking up on deception, mm-hmm. right? It could be as simple as that, and you need to work on that. But if you see repeated patterns, recurrent emotions, and obstacles that continue to show up, I talk about this in business and relationships or whatever, it's on you. And then the next step there in my mind is, and this is, and I do, maybe we won't end right here because I do want to get your take on this. But here's one of the biggest mistakes I think humans make. There's this word authenticity, right, that is tossed around a lot. It is actually one of my favorite things. However, I think we misunderstand it in a sense, because what happens is people go through trauma or they go through things and then they're like, I need boundaries and standards and I need to be authentic to me. And then what happens is they show up in this very rigid, very defensive, very combative way, and all of a sudden they're on Bumble and they haven't even met the person, and the person says one thing to them, and they're all of a sudden attacking them and in this very combative sense. And so who are you being authentic to, right? Mm-hmm. You want to be authentic to your future best self, and that future best self is, hopefully we could all agree, someone who's more kind, more honest, more generous, a better communicator, and most importantly, patient. Right? If you're going to be a good communicator, part of being a good communicator is allowing people to get it. Sometimes you might have to say it once, twice, 3 times. And then sometimes you need to sort of allow them to, essentially do the actions that you're essentially saying. So patience is a big thing, and not just jumping down people's throat. I can't tell you how many times for me where I'm talking to men in particular, and they're just like, look at this. Like, and what they're showing me is, this exchange where there is just talking. They say a particular thing and they're immediately attacked. And it's really interesting because it's almost as if when you're looking at it, you're like, I don't know what she was responding to, but she certainly was not responding to the intent of this text. Now, text is hard,
text
of course.
Tough. Yes.
But it's really interesting how people will see something, immediately project into it, and then all of a sudden get frustrated, angry, or whatever, and that is a big deal. So if you're going to be authentic also to your new self, your better self in relationship, mm-hmm. I think you can't be authentic to the old person, and you can't be authentic to the victim. And I think, because what happens is you're either going to be the victim or the hero in these situations. And to me, the hero is the person who becomes better. The victim is the person who holds on to old wounds and is so boundary heavy they can't grow. I think there's a difference between have boundaries, don't build walls. And I think a lot of people just will build walls around them, and that's the victim mentality. The sort of hero mentality is, I'm going to carry a shield and some armor, but I'm going past the walls of my old self. I'm going to walk out into the world and sort of learn. And I think that's very important that people understand. So I don't know if you have anything more to say about that, but I think we can potentially end there unless you want to sort of jump on some of this authenticity stuff, because I do see it as you get in relationships and people are like, I'm this way, and they're so rigid that, guess what? Your 20-some-year-old self that got hurt, or your 30-year-old self that refuses to change or adapt, okay, that's on you, but you may not have another meaningful relationship if you insist on being authentic to this old wounded victim self.
And the biggest part of that, I think, comes down to self-trust. Because the people who build walls and who are so unwilling to open up again don't trust, they not only don't trust themselves to figure it out if they get burned again, which we will all likely have our hearts broken again. Even if you are married to, even if you meet the right person tomorrow and you're married to them until the day you die, you will still have your heart broken within the context of that relationship. Mm-hmm. And the sooner that you can accept that, and to see that as actually a positive, as a benefit, that you will be able to evolve and grow from that, if you are open to evolving and growing from that, the quicker you will be able to open up a little bit more vulnerably. And yeah, you still need to be vulnerable with the right people, so-called. But part of that is using the discernment tools that are built when you have created that self-trust. And if people are wondering, how to build self-trust and stuff, it can come down to that sort of very overused phrase about like stepping outside your comfort zone and stuff like that. But it is true. People have asked me before, you called me an anomaly the other night, and I thought that was hilarious because I don't think of myself that way at all. But when I ended a 9-year relationship, I also sold my house. I got rid of everything I owned. I changed careers into podcasting business. I'd been doing nutrition before. I packed a single suitcase and I flew to the farthest corner of the globe I could go from my hometown in Bali, and I stayed there for 8 months. And I traveled around the globe several times over by myself. And again, I'm speaking from a place of huge privilege there that I was financially able to do that. But I think that it does speak to the fact that I was sort of ripping off the Band-Aid anyway. So I thought, why not? I might as well just change everything all at once. Yeah. But usually that's not something I would necessarily recommend for people, like those massive life stressors all at one time. Yeah. But it did get me to the point very quickly of shit's going to go wrong, but I've figured out everything else. I can clearly handle whatever gets thrown my way. And I think that that's the only reason why I've really been able to remain as open as I am, because of that, because I know that whatever happens, I'll figure it out.
Yeah.
And everyone is far more capable than they realize. It's just finding that trust within yourself that you will be able to use to your benefit to be able to grow and to be able to open yourself up to those relationships.
Yeah, let's end it on this, and I'll just say what the final two thoughts I have with that, because they're super important. One thing you said, and I agree with this, in business, in personal relationships, in success, in anything you look at, suffering is your greatest source to the insights needed to grow. And that's sort of the first thing you said. And the final thing I would say is, I can't tell you how many people that I have worked with, relationship coaches, counselors, and everything else, and they come to me, and I immediately spot the dysfunction and the problem right away, and it's because they have not changed. And oftentimes it's because they can't, because the person's still in their life, that person is still their boss, or that person they have kids with that person, or whatever.
That's far more difficult.
Far more difficult, but I'll tell you what always works, and this is what I do always. I basically go through and say, you need to change everything that you can change, down to cut your hair, take different routes to work, pick up a new hobby, change the art on the walls. You have to be able to see yourself different, and you have to stop revisiting the old wounds and the old relationships. I mean, I've had, conversations with people where they're still revisiting their old lovers in their fantasies. And I'm like, you cannot do that and expect to move on. You cannot be looking at the same pictures, the same world, the same thing, and expect to move on. So part of the reason it takes some people 6 years, 10 years to get over relationships, and it took you 8 months, is because of that change. And I just think that is also a universal law in my mind. You have to change to change. And that's what you were able to do. And that suffering is sort of the fire you have to walk through to get the insights that you need.
In the podcast that I came out with my story, I said the person that I was in that relationship died with it when I ended it.
And see, that's beautiful to me, because that's what is required. And what episode is that? I mean, so just so you know, we haven't covered this, but Emily has an amazing podcast, the Room to Grow podcast, and she talks a little bit about some of this stuff. But what episode was that particular story? Because I think it'd be really 117 on the Room to Grow podcast. Anything else you want to final thoughts before we end?
I mean, there's so much we could say. I mean, we've talked for hours just this week alone.
I know.
We just keep
it's
going.
Like we have to do a whole series on this.
We do. We're like, should we just hit record on one of these conversations?
We really should.
I feel like if everyone can remain open to the idea of what you can bring to a relationship and what you can get out of a relationship in terms of growth, that's just a really beautiful thing, because I think that that's one of the biggest ways that we can grow is through personal relationships. We can take all the courses, we can, go back to school, we can grow the business, we can do all the things, but what we learn the most about ourselves and how we grow the most as humans is within the context of personal relationships, especially romantic relationships, because they hold a mirror up to us in a way that nothing else in life does. But you will not gain the benefits of that and be able to find, the person that you might be looking for if you remain closed and if you build the walls like you were talking about. If we all walk around Game of Thrones style, it's not going to work very well.
So well said. Emily Gough, thank you so much, my friend. You're such
Jade.
a genius. Thank you so
You're
much.
amazing.
Thanks for hanging out, everybody, and we'll see you at the next show. Everybody, hope you enjoyed that podcast with Emily Gough. I always enjoy hanging out with Emily and was lucky to have her come visit me in Asheville. And she's just amazing. Let me tell you where you can find her. Emily has a podcast, the Room to Grow podcast. We mentioned that on the show. You're definitely going to want to listen to that. I also did a ton of not a ton of podcasts, but I've done 2 podcasts on her. And she's also at Emily Gough Coach on Instagram, EMILY. Gough is GOUGH and COACH at Emily Gough Coach on Instagram. Real quick, let me tell you about the sponsors. Please go check them out. Cured Nutrition is the CBD product that I use. The one I use almost every night is called Zen. It helps me sleep. It's a very high quality CBD. Make sure you check them out. They have several different formulations. They have Rise, which I sometimes use in the morning. They have Zen, which I almost always use at night. And then they also have CBD products for your dog. And there's a muscle rub that I use as well that's a a CBD product. It's a topical, kind of like Bengay on steroids, if you ever used old Bengay or Muscle Rub. But check out Cured Nutrition, and Paleo Valley is the other sponsor to the podcast. Paleo Valley are the grass-fed fermented meat sticks that I absolutely love. These things are about the same macro and calorie breakdown as a hard-boiled egg. We all know how hard-boiled eggs are incredibly satiating, and one of the things that a lot of people go to manage their hunger and their cravings, eggs is a really big one. Meat sticks, though, are one of these things that a lot of people have a bad taste in their mouth about because of the old nitrites and nitrates and, issues around the way some of the animals are treated and the parts that go in. These are completely grass-fed meat sticks, sustainably raised beef. They are fermented. They don't use nitrates and nitrites, and they also have those great omega-3 oils in there that only grass-fed beef has. Check out Paleo Valley and Cured Nutrition. Use the code NEXTLEVEL on checkout. I will get a kickback from that, by the way. You will also get a discount if you use that code. And, of course, Cured Nutrition and Paleo Valley get the sale, so it's a win-win-win for all of us, which is what I love. Please give me a shout-out through the DMs on Instagram. Please roll over to iTunes, or I guess it's iTunes. We're now on Spotify and Amazon as well, but they don't typically do the ratings. You typically do your ratings on iTunes, and I'm incredibly grateful for those. Thanks for hanging out today on the show, and I will see you at the next episode.